Each study is, of course, unique because it depends on the local circumstances, but we did surface a set of common themes which actually resonated pretty well with the research, and I think in some ways went a little bit further. And it's interesting to look at those common themes in a moment against what we've just written up on the board. We actually surfaced 10. We called them lessons. What do you call these things? They're lessons to learn, I suppose. But the interesting thing was the lessons that we identified were of two quite distinctly different sorts. Inevitably, of course, they overlap. In answer to the question, did we find something new? One of the things we found new was that the sort of things that people say about improvement, effectiveness and all the rest of it that we tend to put as lists are not of the same order. And in a sense, we only came to the realisation when we started to massage the list ourselves that these lessons were not of the same order. Some were a lot more important than others. In fact, there were lessons that we think constitute preconditions for substantial improvement in the school. They actually have to be in place for an effective program of improvement to take hold. And then there are other lessons that essentially enable the school to build on those preconditions and to sustain improvement over time. Now, each of the lessons that I'm going to go through we list as discrete. Naturally, of course, there's interaction because schools work in holistic ways. You don't decide I'm going to do a program on this, a program on that, a program on that, and I'm going to improve. But nonetheless, it's important to draw them out. The first, in terms of preconditions, as I said, they're the strategies that have to be in place if improvement's going to take hold. The other thing is they're usually the starting point for the school. They're the place where these schools start because these weren't all always good schools. In most cases, they are schools that have become good schools from not having been particularly good schools. And the importance of the precondition is where they don't exist, they might actually require some intervention and support. And the most obvious example is if there's not the requisite level of leadership capacity in the school. As well as looking at high-performing schools, Graham and I have analysed and worked with a number of underperforming schools. The most famous of which, of course, keeps getting thrown back at us is Albert Park, which we closed because it had no requisite capacity to provide for the kids and was doing a disastrous job. If the requisite capacity is not there, there may need to be intervention to set the improvement path on the way. The first precondition, there were 4 preconditions we found, was actually, and it came there at the end, was leadership. And this is one of the best, and the reality is all of the 9 that follow that. Leadership was fundamental. And this quote from Michael Fullan, I reckon, sums it up. I know of no improving school that doesn't have a principal who's good at leading improvement. I think if you think about it, none of us do. Essentially, all of the schools had a principal and a leadership team with a passion to lead and make a difference in the interests of kids and who was willing to build and spread leadership through the school. Interestingly enough, they'd all been in place for some period of time. They tended to be fairly stable, strong leadership teams. The principal had not necessarily been there all the time, but in each case the principal, if they had not been the principal for a period of time, was part of the leadership team beforehand and had become the principal. So there was that kind of stability. They distributed leadership partly for reasons of, well, partly because they believed in it as the correct way to operate, but partly for reasons of reach, because they knew it was the way to really get to the staff, and partly for reasons of sustainability, because it enables you to sustain what you're trying to do and it's not dependent on one person. I showed you the Hattie stuff before, the importance of teaching the 30%. I'm a Hattie devotee. I had expected, as somebody said up there, that high-performing teachers would be the critical factor. Didn't turn out to be the case. High-performing leaders turned out to be the critical factor. And if you think about it, that's not in conflict with John Hattie's view. Because essentially, unless you have the right leadership in place, you can't generate high-performance teaching, because the conditions have to be there for teachers to perform at a high level.